It's AR, the equalizer, the data scientist of boxing, spinning the block for another breakdown. Let's get into it. In today's video, we will be exploring the vault, the strategy execution vault. Yes, I've dug in the crates. I've dug up some film study, or a film that we're going to break down and study, which is Roy Jones Jr. versus James Toney, November 18th of the year of 1994 for the IBF Super Middleweight World Championship. You heard? Yes, indeed. In this fight, leading up to this fight, just a little backdrop, James Toney was a pretty feared guy from the weight classes middleweight and super middleweight. He was a feared guy. James Toney, prior to facing Roy Jones Jr., had knocked off the likes of Michael Nunn, in which he took Michael Nunn's IBF world title at middleweight. And this was in the year of 1991, May 10th. Michael Nunn at the time was 36-0, a heavy favorite. And James Toney, he had stopped this guy. He stopped him, right? Then after that, he had a split decision with Reggie Johnson. After that, he faced Francesco Dell'Acquia. He had a draw with Mike McCollum, very underrated body snatcher himself. And he faced a few more guys, rematched Mike McCollum, but he knocked off other guys that stepped up. Like, the other guys that stepped up, they posed no threat. And I believe during this time, James Toney being so dominant, you know what I mean? Before stepping in the ring with Roy Jones Jr., James Toney had stopped, let's see, I believe like 8 of his, last 12 opponents before, you know what I mean? So he was a very feared guy, you know what I'm saying? And Roy Jones, he was coming into the ring as the underdog, really hadn't proved too much. The only notable name that he had faced prior to stepping in the ring with James Toney was the likes of a Bernard Hopkins, in which at the time, they did, Roy Jones Jr. and Bernard Hopkins, they did fight for the vacant IBF World Middleweight title, so they were both still, scratching the surface and trying to prove themselves in the boxing world, you know what I mean? But I'm breaking this video down, I'm breaking down this film study. In my opinion, this is the fight that put Roy Jones Jr. on the map. A lot of people can say, oh, well, he was already knocking dudes out before James Toney. He had beat Bernard Hopkins. People, we got to understand that Bernard Hopkins didn't come into world prominence in the boxing world until he had stopped Felix Trinidad. Like, Bernard Hopkins, he was making some noise, but he was just another guy that was holding the title. When he stopped Felix Trinidad, that's when people really started, because Bernard Hopkins was the underdog in that fight, people. He was the heavy underdog. Like, everybody had Felix Trinidad stopping Bernard Hopkins, but Bernard Hopkins defeated the odds and shocked the world. That shot Bernard Hopkins' star power through the ceiling. And this is nearly, matter of fact, almost 10 years after the Roy Jones Jr. defeat that he had faced. They faced each other May 22nd of 1993, and Bernard Hopkins didn't face off with Felix Trinidad until, after the Twin Towers had fell, September of 2001. So that's about 8 years, you know what I mean? 8-year span. But don't want to spend too much more time on that. Roy Jones Jr., his first real test in the eyes of the boxing pundits was against James Toney, in which he was a heavy underdog. I don't know what the odds were. I'm not a gambling man, I'm not a betting man, but I know that that's a big thing in boxing in Vegas. But I know that he was a heavy underdog. And Roy Jones had so much to prove in this fight. So much to prove. You know, you can even see in the ring entrance, the ring walk, he has charisma. He comes out in a white tuxedo, has the lion patch in the back of his head. Just so much charisma, so much confidence, but the world was really betting against him. Like, who is this guy? People really didn't know who he was. If you even listen to Jim Lampley and the commentators closely for TV KO, which eventually turned into HBO boxing, but if you listen to the commentators closely, they kept saying, we really don't know too much about Roy Jones Jr. This was Roy Jones Jr.'s coming out party, and he exceeded expectations heavily. This performance catapulted Roy Jones Jr. into the star the legend that we know today. Everything that he did after this performance, it was just an addition. It was just an add-on. Because we have to understand how feared and how great James Toney actually was at this time. In 1994, James Toney was the man. James Toney was the man. James Toney, he was 44-0 with only 2 draws. Roy Jones Jr., 26-0. No draws, no losses. Right, so this is a fight of the undefeateds, of where somebody's O has to go. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention that James Toney had 29 knockouts at this point. 29 KOs. You know what I mean? And Roy Jones Jr., he also had a high knockout percentage as well. Only going the distance with Jorge Castro, Bernard Hopkins, and Furman Sherino. But everybody else he had stopped. You know, so he had 23 knockouts at this point. Richard Steele is the referee, legendary referee. With no further ado, man, we're going to get into the very fight that put Roy Jones Jr. on the map, that introduced himself to the boxing world as the athletic specimen that he was. From the opening bell, Roy Jones Jr., he has his hands up like he's catching a baseball in a stance of, you know, you got some trainers that call it the mongoose style. His hands aren't, you know, he's not being defensively minded. His hands are away from his face because he's trying to gauge the distance on where he can hit the head or the body of James Toney, in which we see some unorthodox tactics where he's leading with his lead hook. With the lead left hook, he's using that as a jab. Very unorthodox, definitely not textbook at all. But his hand speed is blazing. He's punching like a lightweight as far as speed goes. He's punching with the speed of a lightweight, or you can even say a featherweight, a flyweight. He's punching with blazing speed at 168 pounds. It's something that we haven't seen before. Will we ever see it again? I like Jerron Boo tennis. I'll just say that. But we haven't seen this before at this point. Roy Jones is just figuring out his range and how he can tee off on James Toney. But you guys have to understand, at this point of James Toney's career, he's known notoriously for his slick style. His defense, that shell, the Midwest shoulder roll. Some call it the Philly shell, some call it the Mayweather defense. But in this video, I'm going to call it the Midwest shoulder roll because that's what the term originally was. He is from the Midwest, Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor. Well, they say Ann Arbor, but he's from Grand Rapids, Michigan, stand up. Yeah, he's utilizing the Midwest shoulder roll, which was a very hard to penetrate defensive shell. But Roy Jones Jr., he's just finding those cracks. He's finding those cracks, and it's the hand speed that's disrupting James Toney's rhythm. Elusive footwork, the superior footwork that Roy Jones Jr. is putting on display is giving James Toney trouble as he's flat-footed, trying to plot and approach himself to Roy Jones Jr., but Roy Jones Jr. is just taking steps out of the way, leaping steps out of the way, while maintaining this energy. Roy Jones Jr. was definitely a physical specimen. In round one, it was just a fill-out round for him. showing great ring generalship, using great lateral movement, using the jab a little bit, but not really putting much behind the jab, just using it as a rangefinder, but tapping James Toney with those lead left hooks and right hands to follow up right after. Roy Jones Jr., he took James Toney to school in this fight, and it was viewed as the other way around, that James Toney would take Roy Jones Jr. to school, but Roy Jones did his thing. This put him on the map. One thing I'll highlight is the reflexes of Roy Jones Jr. Anytime James Toney would step in to commit behind the punch, Roy Jones Jr. is just waiting for an opening on James Toney to counter. And his hands, his reflexes were so fast that he was able to do what he wanted at will. I mean, it's not even like James Toney had bad defense or a bad shell. I believe that this night, Roy Jones Jr. would have beat anybody that stepped up, that was at his weight class. He would have beat anybody or gave anybody a run for their money, because his speed, his reflexes, his footwork, everything was just top notch, grade A. You know, people would point out that his defense wasn't the greatest. Well, let me tell you, people, his feet, his footwork was his defense, which is why in his older years, he started, getting hit more and, start getting knocked out. I hate to say it, but he started getting knocked out because his foot speed has slowed down. But a prime Roy Jones Jr. was an absolute physical specimen, and his feet was his defense, people. So all he had to do was keep his hand in a neutral guard, just out wide enough to be able to attack his man. But whenever his man will come to him, all he have to do is just use lateral movement and get out the way. Or if they get too close, just tie him up and reset. It was a nightmare for anybody to deal with. And we see in round 3, it's just pretty much the same thing. Roy Jones is teeing off at will. He's using his lead hand as a rangefinder and pawing with the jab, but he's extending it, keeping his hand extended, which is very unorthodox and not textbook, because it's very dangerous to leave any type of opening on your body or have your arms outstretched, because you can get floored like that easily. But because Roy Jones Jr. was so elusive at this point in his career, he can get away with it. And it's not just athleticism that Roy Jones Jr. was showcasing. Notice that the guy is angling. He's angling as he's punching. As he's punching, he's being defensively sound to keep his head off the center line and to keep his body off the center line. As you can see, Roy Jones Jr. is constantly angling to his right to James Toney's left, taking away James Toney jab arm. You know what I mean? He's putting his shoulder on James Toney jab arm and steadily angling to his right and making James Toney reset. Roy Jones Jr. was displaying great ring generalship, great ring IQ in this fight. And it's a fight that I often watch because it was such a brilliant performance against a legend in James Toney. And as Roy Jones Jr. gets comfortable, we see him do these tactics. He's playing around. He's trying to get James Toney to overcommit. I feel as if he has James Toney figured out at this point, and now he's, trying to, get off. He's trying to get off, and he's opening up the fight. So we see more showboating, and then he does the chicken wing outstretch, and James Toney makes the mistake of trying to mimic what Roy Jones Jr. is doing, but Roy Jones' reflexes is so fast and quick that he catches James Toney with his hands down. I mean, Roy Jones, man, it's a class act in the ring. That happened in round 3. It was the highlight of the fight, for it was the only knockdown in which it really wasn't a knockdown. James Toney, he just got caught off balance, and yes, his gloves may have touched the canvas. The ropes held him up, so technically it is a knockdown, but he was just off balance. That's all. And shocked at how fast Roy Jones had hit him. This is the story of the fight. James Toney, being a Hall of Fame boxer, a legendary boxer, he couldn't figure out Roy Jones Jr. at all. Because Roy Jones Jr. at this time, he was the first of his kind. A middleweight, a super middleweight with hand speed like a flyweight and punching power like that of a light heavyweight or heavyweight. You know, speed is power. I wouldn't say Roy Jones had the most electric punching power. Nah, that wasn't the case. He hit hard, don't get it twisted, but it was his speed that was his power. And he could put guys out. You know, don't get it twisted. Don't get it mistaken. I'm not saying that Roy Jones wasn't a heavy hitter, but it was his hand speed that really offset guys, and his foot speed and his agility, his lateral movement that really posed problems for guys who were flat-footed or who wasn't as fast as him in the footwork department. And as the fight goes on, this is just what it is. Roy Jones maintaining his hand speed while James Toney is getting tired. But as James Toney is getting tired, Roy Jones is just working. His work rate was phenomenal. You know, the hand speed displayed at 45 seconds left in the 7th round. Those uppercuts, those flurry of shots. I mean, it was something to see. But you have to give James Toney his credit for standing there and being able to nullify some of those attacks, because an average boxer, the fight would have been over anybody else. You know, so even though James Toney got dominated this fight, it's not to say that James Toney is trash or he wasn't as good as what he was advertised to be. That wasn't the case at all. Roy Jones Jr., he was just the better man. He was the faster man, and his style was a stylistic nightmare for James Toney. James Toney couldn't keep up with him in the hand speed department. He couldn't keep up with him in the foot speed department, and that played a major difference in this fight. Outside of round 3, outside of round 7, it was just a Roy Jones show. Like the whole fight was a Roy Jones show, but round 3 was it was the lone knockdown of the fight. Round 7 is where we see that blazing hand speed displayed in flurries, and we see the blazing hand speed all throughout the fight. But it was in these spots and in these moments where Roy Jones Jr. really shined and showed the boxing world that he was a pound-for-pound great, and that he was not to be overlooked, that he was not to be played with, and he deserved all the praise that he gets today. You know what I mean? Ultimately, this fight had gone all 12 rounds. Roy Jones Jr., he defeats James Toney. James Toney, he puts up a valiant effort, a very valiant effort. He fights all 12 rounds. He's standing there, not really showing too much fatigue, anything. He's still trying to, even in the 12th round, we see James Toney still trying to make a fight, still trying to walk to Roy Jones Jr., but he just didn't have an answer for that hand speed, that foot speed. You know what I mean? James Toney, he went on to still do great things, campaigned at light heavyweight all the way up to heavyweight, you know what I mean, and defeated Evander Holyfield at heavyweight. James Toney still did great things even after this fight. This wasn't the end of the road for James Toney. It was just that he had faced a better guy. And this is what you get with real boxing. When the best fight the best, somebody has to lose. You know, it doesn't make them any lesser of a fighter or a boxer. It's just that it has to be one victor. You know what I mean? Or it can be even, it could be a draw, but the majority of the time it has to be one victor. And Roy Jones Jr. came out victorious this fight, improved to 27-0. It wasn't a knockout, and he went on to do legendary things. But that's all I got for you all. If you all enjoyed the video, please smash the like button. Please share the content with your friends and family in the boxing community. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell for it's nothing but heat that I'm dropping. You know what I mean? Often. So get notified anytime there's an upload or a premiere, or if I'm going live. Please smash the subscribe button, smash the like button, hit the notification bell. That's what it is, man. It's AR the equalizer, the data scientist of boxing. You heard? It's been real, family. Until next time, we out.